Here's something that might surprise you. A lot of wealthy people drive cars that are years old, live in houses smaller than you'd expect, and would never dream of buying half the things that are considered normal purchases for everyone else. Meanwhile, plenty of people living paycheck to paycheck are spending money on things that genuinely wealthy people wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Today I'm breaking down 10 specific things rich people almost never waste money on, and more importantly, exactly why avoiding each one matters so much for actually building wealth. Stick around because number 7 is the one that trips up almost everyone, no matter their income. Before we get into the list, you need to understand one thing that separates how wealthy people think about money compared to how most people think about money, because this one mental shift explains every single item on this list. Most people evaluate a purchase based on whether they can afford the payment. Wealthy people evaluate a purchase based on what else that money could be doing for them instead. That single difference in thinking, payment versus opportunity cost, is the actual foundation underneath everything we're about to cover. Keep that idea in mind as we go through each one, because it'll make every single item on this list make a lot more sense. There's also a second piece of this mindset worth mentioning before we dive in. Wealthy people, especially those who built their wealth rather than inherited it, tend to think in terms of what a dollar could become over time rather than what it can buy right now. $100 spent today is gone. $100 invested and left alone for 20 years can genuinely turn into several $100s, sometimes more depending on where it's put. Every purchase in the back of a wealthy person's mind carries this quiet comparison. What this money could become if it wasn't spent right now. That comparison doesn't stop them from spending entirely, but it does make them noticeably more selective about which purchases are actually worth giving up that future potential for. The first thing rich people rarely waste money on is depreciating assets bought on credit. A brand new car loses roughly 20% of its value the moment it leaves the lot and continues losing value every single year after that. Buying one of these on a loan means you're paying interest on an asset that's actively becoming worth less the entire time you're paying it off. Wealthy people are far more likely to buy a reliable used car in cash or lease strategically for business purposes where it makes tax sense than to finance a rapidly depreciating asset over 5 or 6 years. The math simply doesn't work in their favor, and they know it. To put a number on this, someone who finances a $45,000 new car over 6 years at a typical interest rate might end up paying several $1,000s in interest alone, on top of the vehicle already losing tens of thousands of dollars in value over that same period. Compare that to buying a 3-year-old version of the same car in cash, which sidesteps both the steepest depreciation curve and the interest payments entirely. The car still gets you to work every day either way. The difference is purely in how much of your money quietly disappears in the process. The second thing is credit card interest. This one might be the single biggest wealth killer for average earners, and wealthy people avoid it almost entirely because they understand exactly what it costs. Carrying a balance at 20 or 25% interest means you're paying an enormous premium on everything you buy, month after month, compounding against you instead of for you. Wealthy people either pay their balance in full every single month, using the card purely for rewards and convenience, or they simply don't use credit at all for everyday spending. The rare instances where they do carry debt are almost always tied to appreciating assets like real estate, at interest rates far lower than a typical credit card. The math here is genuinely brutal when you actually sit down and calculate it. A $5,000 balance at 22% interest, paying only the minimum each month, can take over a decade to pay off and end up costing several $1,000s in interest on top of the original amount. That's money that produced absolutely nothing in return. No asset, no experience worth remembering, just a fee for having borrowed money you didn't have at the time. Wealthy people treat avoiding this specific trap as close to a non-negotiable rule, precisely because they've seen how quickly it can undo progress made everywhere else in a budget. The third thing is lottery tickets and other pure gambling. The math on lottery tickets is brutal. You're statistically far more likely to be struck by lightning than to win a major jackpot, and the expected return on every dollar spent is deeply negative. Wealthy people generally understand expected value well enough to recognize this isn't a wealth-building strategy. It's entertainment with terrible odds dressed up as opportunity. They might occasionally buy a ticket for fun with no real expectation attached, but you won't find genuinely wealthy people treating lottery tickets as any kind of financial plan. Interestingly, studies on lottery spending consistently show it's disproportionately concentrated among lower-income households, often specifically because it's marketed as a legitimate path to financial escape, when the actual odds make it closer to setting money on fire for the small thrill of possibility. The fourth thing is impulse purchases made without a plan. This doesn't mean wealthy people never buy anything spontaneously. It means they rarely buy expensive things purely on impulse, without at least a day or two of consideration first. There's a well-documented pattern where waiting even 24 hours before a non-essential purchase dramatically reduces the odds you'll actually go through with it, simply because the emotional urgency fades and you can evaluate the purchase more rationally. Wealthy people tend to build this pause into how they spend almost automatically, which prevents a huge number of purchases that other people make and regret within days. This habit alone, if you strip away everything else on this list, would likely prevent more unnecessary spending than any other single change most people could make. The fifth thing is extended warranties on inexpensive items. Buying a $40 toaster and getting talked into a 15 or 3-year warranty sounds reasonable in the moment, but the math almost never favors the buyer. These warranties are typically priced well above the actual expected cost of repairs or replacement, which is exactly why retailers push them so aggressively. The profit margin on warranties is often higher than on the product itself. Wealthy people tend to self-insure smaller purchases, meaning they simply accept the small risk of needing to replace something and skip paying for protection against a loss that wouldn't meaningfully hurt them anyway. The logic scales down to anyone, regardless of income. If losing the item entirely wouldn't be a significant financial setback, insuring against that loss rarely makes mathematical sense. The sixth thing is status purchases made specifically to impress other people. This is a big one, and it's genuinely counterintuitive for a lot of people who assume wealthy people love flashy displays of money. In reality, a substantial number of truly wealthy people, especially those who built their wealth rather than inherited it, are notably unimpressed by logos, brand names, and status symbols. Buying something specifically because of what it signals to other people, rather than because of the actual value it provides you, is a pattern wealthy people tend to grow out of fairly early, often because they realize the people whose opinion they were trying to influence weren't paying nearly as much attention as they assumed. There's a somewhat well-known observation that the people most focused on displaying wealth outwardly are frequently not the people with the most of it, while many of the wealthiest individuals dress and live in ways that wouldn't stand out in a crowd at all. The seventh thing, and this is the one that trips up almost everyone regardless of income, is subscriptions and memberships they don't actually use. This one is sneaky because it doesn't feel like spending in the moment. The money just quietly leaves your account every month, whether you use the service or not. Wealthy people are often surprisingly disciplined about auditing their recurring expenses, specifically because they understand that small, forgotten monthly charges compound into a genuinely large amount over a year. And that money sitting unused in a subscription is money not working for them anywhere else. A lot of people, regardless of income level, are quietly paying for 3 or 4 services they haven't opened in months. And this single habit alone can be worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars a year once you actually add it up. What makes subscriptions specifically dangerous compared to other spending is that they're designed to be forgotten. Most people can tell you exactly what they spent on their last vacation, but very few people can immediately list every single subscription currently being charged to their card without actually going and checking. That gap between what you remember spending and what you're actually spending is precisely where subscriptions do their damage. A genuinely wealthy person's discipline here isn't about avoiding subscriptions entirely. Plenty of them have several. It's about reviewing them often enough that none of them are quietly running on autopilot long after they stopped providing value. The eighth thing is paying full retail price without ever comparing options or negotiating. This might sound like an odd habit to associate with wealthy people, since you'd assume money being tight is what drives someone to comparison shop. But plenty of wealthy people got that way partly by refusing to overpay unnecessarily, even on purchases they could easily afford. Negotiating a car price, comparing insurance rates every year or two, asking whether a better rate exists on a service, these habits don't disappear once someone has money, and in a lot of cases they're part of exactly why that person has money in the first place. There's an interesting pattern here worth pointing out. A lot of self-made wealthy people describe this habit as something they never grew out of, even long after money stopped being tight for them. It's less about needing to save that particular amount and more about a deeply ingrained discomfort with overpaying for something when a better price was available with just a small amount of effort. That discomfort, more than any specific dollar amount, is what keeps this habit alive well past the point where it's financially necessary. Some of the wealthiest self-made individuals in the world have openly talked about still negotiating small purchases decades after money became a non-issue for them, simply because the habit became part of who they are, not just a financial strategy tied to a particular income level. The ninth thing is investments they don't understand. Wealthy people are generally far more cautious about putting money into something they can't clearly explain to someone else. Whether that's a complicated investment product, a trendy speculative asset, or a business opportunity a friend is pitching them. This isn't about avoiding risk entirely. Plenty of wealthy people take on significant calculated risk in businesses or investments. It's specifically about avoiding risk they don't actually understand, which is a very different thing. If you can't explain how something makes money or exactly what could cause you to lose it, that's usually a signal to wealthy investors that they need more information, not more money invested. This particular habit tends to protect wealthy people from a huge number of scams and speculative bubbles that catch less careful investors off guard. Whenever a new investment trend appears promising unusually high returns with very little explanation for why those returns exist, wealthy investors are disproportionately likely to sit it out entirely, simply because the underlying mechanism doesn't hold up to basic scrutiny. This isn't about being naturally more skeptical as a personality trait. It's a practiced habit of asking one simple question before any significant investment. Do I actually understand what happens to my money here, step by step, or am I just trusting that it'll work out? History is full of examples of speculative bubbles and outright scams that swept up huge numbers of everyday investors. While a disproportionate share of genuinely wealthy, experienced investors sat those exact same trends out, specifically because they couldn't get a straight answer to that one basic question. And the 10th thing is time. Oddly enough, even though it's not money in the traditional sense, wealthy people are frequently very deliberate about not wasting time on tasks that don't require their specific skills, when paying someone else to handle it would free them up for something more valuable. This shows up in outsourcing things like cleaning, basic home repairs, or administrative tasks, not out of laziness, but because they've done the actual math on what their time is worth, and they'd rather spend hours on something that grows their income or their business than save a comparatively small amount of money doing something themselves that someone else could do just as well. This particular mindset scales down surprisingly well to almost any income level, even if the specific numbers look different. Someone earning a modest salary might not be able to justify hiring a full-time assistant, but the underlying question still applies to a smaller degree. Is spending 3 hours on a task that saves $20 actually the best use of that time, compared to picking up a few hours of side work, or spending that time developing a skill that increases future earning potential? The specific trade-off changes depending on income, but the habit of actually asking the question, rather than assuming your own time has no cost, is exactly the same regardless of how much money someone currently has. Now that we've gone through the list, let's talk about why this pattern holds up so consistently across so many wealthy people, because it's not a coincidence. And it's not about being naturally frugal or naturally disciplined. The real thread connecting every single item on this list is that wealthy people are consistently asking a different question than most people ask before spending money. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" they're asking, "Is this actually the best use of this money right now, compared to every other thing I could do with it?" That second question is a much higher bar to clear, and it naturally filters out an enormous amount of the spending that quietly drains most people's finances without them ever noticing. It's worth being clear about. Something important here, too. This isn't about never spending money on anything enjoyable. Wealthy people absolutely spend money on things they value, sometimes in amounts that would shock the average person. The difference isn't restriction, it's intention. They spend significant amounts on things that genuinely matter to them, and they're remarkably disciplined about avoiding the 10 categories we just covered, which tend to drain money without providing much real value in return. Let's talk about how you can actually apply this thinking to your own life. Starting today, rather than just nodding along and going right back to your old habits after this video ends, start by auditing your subscriptions this week. Pull up your bank statement, go through the last 2 months of charges, and circle every recurring subscription you can find. For each one, ask honestly whether you've used it meaningfully in the last 30 days. If the answer is no, cancel it. This single exercise alone regularly uncovers $50 to $100 a month in charges people had genuinely forgotten they were paying for. Set a recurring reminder to repeat this same audit every 3 months, since new subscriptions have a way of quietly creeping back in over time, especially free trials that silently convert into paid charges once the trial period ends. Next, look at any credit card balance you're currently carrying. If you're paying interest on a balance every month, that interest is very likely the single most expensive thing in your entire budget, dollar for dollar. Prioritizing paying that down, even before increasing your savings elsewhere, usually produces a better return than almost any other financial move available to you, simply because you're eliminating a guaranteed cost rather than hoping for an uncertain gain. Then, before your next non-essential purchase over a certain amount, whatever threshold feels meaningful for your income, build in a genuine waiting period. 24 hours for smaller purchases, maybe a full week for larger ones. This isn't about denying yourself things you want. It's about making sure the purchases you do make are ones you actually considered, rather than ones you regret within a few days. Also, take a look at anything you're currently paying full price for out of habit rather than checking whether a better option exists. Insurance rates, phone plans, internet service, even some subscriptions, a single phone call, or a few minutes of comparison shopping once a year regularly saves people a meaningful amount of money for very little effort. A good approach is picking just one recurring bill each month to review, rather than trying to tackle everything at once, so the habit actually becomes sustainable rather than another overwhelming task you attempt once and abandon. And finally, get honest with yourself about which purchases in your own life are genuinely about the item itself, and which ones are more about how you hope they'll make you look to other people. This one requires some real self-reflection, and it's uncomfortable for almost everyone, because most of us have at least a few purchases sitting somewhere in our life that fall into that second category. Recognizing them is the first step toward spending your money on things that actually matter to you, instead of things that are mostly meant to be seen by other people. Let's also address a common misconception that tends to come up whenever this topic gets discussed. The idea that being careful with money like this means being cheap or being unable to enjoy your life. That's genuinely not what this is about. There's an important distinction between being frugal and being cheap. Being cheap means avoiding spending money even in situations where spending would clearly improve your life or genuinely save you money or time down the road. Being frugal, the way wealthy people tend to practice it, means being thoughtful about where your money goes, so that when you do spend, it's on things that actually matter to you, rather than things that just happen to be in front of you at the moment. A useful way to think about this distinction is through what some people call the difference between price and cost. Price is what you pay up front. Cost is what something actually takes from you over time, once you account for how often you use it, how long it lasts, and what else that money could have done instead. A cheap item that breaks in 6 months and gets replaced twice can genuinely cost more than a well-made item bought once and used for a decade. Wealthy people tend to optimize for that second number, actual long-term cost, rather than simply chasing the lowest price tag in the moment. which is exactly why this mindset doesn't always look like obvious frugality from the outside. It's also worth mentioning that this isn't purely about income level either. Plenty of people earning modest incomes apply these same principles and build meaningful wealth over time, while plenty of people earning very high incomes fall into several of these traps and end up with surprisingly little to show for years of strong earnings. The habits matter more than the paycheck, which is genuinely good news, because it means you don't need to already be wealthy to start applying this exact way of thinking to your own money, starting with your very next paycheck. One more thing worth mentioning. None of these 10 habits require any special financial knowledge, a finance degree, or insider access to information regular people don't have. Every single one of them is something anyone can start applying immediately, using nothing more than the questions we just walked through. That's part of why this pattern shows up so consistently across wealthy people from wildly different backgrounds, industries, and starting points. It's not a secret system available only to a select few. It's a consistent way of thinking that anyone can adopt, regardless of where they're starting from financially right now. There's a reason this pattern tends to show up across such different kinds of wealthy people too. Entrepreneurs, doctors, people who inherited money and managed to grow it, people who built businesses from nothing. Despite coming from completely different starting points and industries, the underlying discipline around these 10 specific categories shows up again and again. That consistency is exactly what makes this list worth paying attention to, rather than dismissing it as one particular type of wealthy person's personal quirks. Let's recap everything we covered today. Rich people consistently avoid wasting money on depreciating assets bought on credit. Credit card interest, lottery tickets, and gambling, unplanned impulse purchases, extended warranties on inexpensive items, status purchases meant purely to impress others, forgotten subscriptions, full retail prices without comparison or negotiation, investments they don't understand, and wasting their own time on tasks that don't require their specific skills. The underlying thread connecting all 10 is a consistent habit of asking whether this is genuinely the best use of this money right now, rather than simply asking whether the purchase is affordable. Remember this: wealth isn't primarily built through a handful of brilliant financial decisions. It's built through consistently avoiding a fairly short list of unnecessary financial leaks, month after month, year after year, which frees up far more money for the things that actually build wealth over time, like consistent saving and smart investing. None of these 10 habits are complicated or require access to information the average person doesn't have. They simply require noticing them and then choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to do something different, until the new behavior stops feeling like a decision at all and just becomes how you naturally handle money going forward. If this video actually helped you see your own spending a little differently, hit that like button and subscribe, because we cover practical, real-world money habits exactly like this every single week. Drop a comment and let me know, which of these 10 did you immediately recognize in your own spending? I'd genuinely like to know which one catches the most people off guard, and whether it was one of the obvious ones like credit card interest, or one of the sneakier ones like forgotten subscriptions that most people don't even think to check. In the next video, we're covering the flip side of this, the things wealthy people actually do spend generously on, and why those specific purchases are considered worth every dollar, even when they cost far more than what most people would ever consider reasonable. So make sure you hit that bell icon so you don't miss it. See you in the next one.